Hello and welcome to the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Snyder, and I warmly welcome you around our hearth. Now, before we get started, I want to let you know about some things. So, I've decided that, at least for the moment, I don't really have very good justification for having two separate Mythic Mind podcast feeds, and so, or at least on the public level. And so I'm going to start to move some content from here over to the main show, that is the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast. Now, the odds are pretty high that if you sub to the Fellowship show, you already sub to the Legacy show as well, but make sure that you do if that's not already the case. And if you're currently listening to this on the Legacy podcast, then just keep doing what you're doing. I do have some ideas for the Fellowship show down the road, and so don't delete it from your library, but you also should not expect it to be updated for a while. So again, for the foreseeable future, you can expect everything to come through one podcast. That is the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast. Now, for our monthly patron chat, we're continuing to work through the Poetic Edda together. And I should begin by apologizing for my part in this, as I'm still coming off of a cold that hit my lungs pretty hard, and so I was not at my A game during this conversation, resulting in more mispronunciations than is typical, even of some fairly familiar terms. I just had a hard time getting some words out, and I coughed into the mic a few times, and so I do apologize for that. But with that aside, let's go ahead and get to it. All right, welcome back to our Mythic Mind patron chats as we deal with the Poetic Edda, continue to work through that piece by piece. I'm going to hit the next four sections this round. Now, as a reminder, we are all amateurs here, kind of going down the rapids with our homemade rafts, and but I think it's been a good run so far, and I'm really enjoying the conversations that are coming out of this. Before we get into the main topic, I want us to start just going around each time and filling each other in, filling the listeners in on whatever we have going on. And so if we're making something, if we're just reading something, thinking about something, listening to something, just something that's going on in your life, just give some kind of update. Josh, what do you have for us?
Yeah, so I'm Josh. I'm a student at Memoria College right now, actually in the Masters of Arts Great Books program. So basically in the class I'm in right now, we're reading either part of or an entire like great text a week. Most of those are short enough where it's not too crazy to read in a week, but basically writing on those like roughly once a week, and then for a final paper doing something with trying to do something with kind of like just like the mystery of Providence as a theme in Oedipus Rex right now. So just kind of consulting some scholarship and figuring out more specifically what direction to go in that, and like what part of the text I'm going to talk about with that. And then also working on a seven ecumenical councils class that I'm working with my pastor on that to teach it at our church to mostly lay people who don't really even know what like the patristic era of church history is. So the challenge of being like how how specific or how general to go with that. So basically that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's definitely much needed. I used to teach at a classical Christian high school, and for I think it was 10th, maybe 11th grade, 11th grade, it was systematic theology. And basically, the way I did that was by primarily focusing on the ecumenical councils to really get at sort of the way core, mere Christianity, essential Christian orthodoxy, how these
Mhm.
ideas came together, and the heresies that were dealt with, and the way that those present themselves today in ways that the layperson very often isn't even going to recognize. And so I think that dealing with that early church period, it's so important and so ever applicable. So that's fantastic that you're doing that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Really excited
yeah,
about it.
yeah, good. Uh, Chase, what's something you have going on?
Yeah, right now I'm back up in the Dallas area with my family, so I brought a bunch of books up to read. Um, we have a guy from my church found out that I was taking these classes and I was reading a lot of stuff, and he invited me to. I guess him and buddies have met for 20 years in a group called like the I guess it's the Anatheum. Anatheum, is that right? Yeah, but it's they go through like a book a month. So this next book is The Way of All Flesh by Samuel Butler, which I'd never heard of, but we'll see. So working through that one, and then I'm going to jump into the Iliad here shortly.
Yeah,
I'm
and
excited about that.
you definitely need to produce something out there, make a podcast. You've been reading a lot of really good stuff recently. um, yeah, even beyond the stuff we've been doing together. So that's fantastic that you've been doing all that. Um, yeah, and then on my end, I did just get confirmation that next week I should get an official offer for a book deal. So hopefully I'll be getting my first book out there in the near future. So that's exciting. And
That's
then
awesome.
been making some progress on the screenplay that I've been invited to collaborate on, which is just awesome. That like that's not something even a year ago was even on my radar, and then suddenly I get this invitation, and I've talked about that some in the Discords. If you want more information, become a patron. But otherwise, definitely excited about the potential that's there. Just you never know where the road's going to take you. All right. Well, I guess we can go ahead and dive into this, starting with, let's see, the Hymnir's poem. All right, so I will read at least some of the introduction, maybe all of it, provided by Larrington here, so that way we all have a general sense of what it is that we're dealing with. And so Hymnir's poem, or Hymiskvida, is badly preserved in the manuscript, but we can fill in the gaps from Snorri Sturluson, who gave us the prose edda. And so this is a difficult poem, yeah, text to work with. I was listening to Jack Crawford talk about this. Jack Crawford, who's an Old Norse specialist, and he has his own translation of the Edda. And he even said that this is just a notoriously difficult text to work together because it's likely that we have some fragments, we have sections of like the story from an older time mixed in with some updates, and so it's not entirely consistent. It kind of seems like some of the characters were swapped out, and so Thor, his companion in the story is Tyr, but it kind of seems like maybe it was Loki at some point, maybe somebody else. And so it's just across the board. It's difficult to figure out exactly what it is that we're dealing with. But the gods decide to have a feast and they compel the giant Aegir to prepare it. This may reflect the Scandinavian royal practices in which the king enforces his authority on his subordinates by visiting their homes and demanding to be feasted. Cunningly, Aegir demands an enormous cauldron in which to brew beer for the feast. This can only be obtained with great danger from the giant Hymnir. Tyr, who is probably not the original protagonist of the poem, and Thor set off to obtain the cauldron. And like most encounters between Thor and the giants, the adventure turns into a trial of strength. And so that's really the gist of the story. So that they're going off to get this giant beer cauldron from this giant. Um, so what do we think about this text?
I think you were definitely, it made me feel a lot better when you kind of started this off to say that this would be a difficult thing to talk, because I felt like I had a lot more to say about the first probably two or three texts within the Poetic Edda itself, but it almost seems like, I guess, like there's like the kind of this recurring theme in like Norse mythology of kind of just like this right of the strongest, and it seems like that's probably in a sense like what's being shown, like just like with like I guess like Thor's arc, if anything, in this text. I'm not exactly sure, but beyond that, maybe like hospitality. I guess in some ways you could like argue that that would be a theme in some ways, but yeah, other than that, it's kind of hard to pin down exactly like in any other like higher purpose in a sense.
Yeah, we do see that even Hymir, even this giant that they came to get the cauldron from, shows some degree of hospitality to Thor and Tyr here. In that Thor like basically eats all of his stuff, like all of his animals, and so then they have to go fishing in order to get more food. But then even that turns into a, essentially a contest of strength in the game that they're hunting. Um, I don't know, Chase. Do you have anything to say about this poem?
Yeah, I will say I liked the vocabulary for a beard, the cheek forest. I think that's a
Yes,
great
that
one
was a good
for
one.
us. uh, I I thought it was interesting where it talked about like the giantess Wheat walking across the floor, like he saw that like they recognize who Thor is and that he slays the giants um, in a lot of battles. Uh, yeah, it's hard to kind of tell exactly what it is. Like at the end, it almost seems like it's like a caper almost, like they just came and stole like the pot and he's running out with it, and he has to turn around and like kill all the giants. I don't know.
Right, despite the fact that he won it, he won it fair and square, and so it was given to him. Um, it and there's some female giant who helps him by telling him. So okay, so to backtrack a little bit. So Hymir and Thor are fishing together because I don't know. I guess they're buddies now. I don't know. And so Hymir the giant he catches two whales, which I mean that's pretty impressive. To go fishing and you catch a couple of whales, and then Thor goes fishing and he catches the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, the serpent that stretches across the entire world. So that's what Thor catches. Um, and in the prose edit, there's a version of the story that has some more details in it. When he pulls up the Midgard serpent and he's about to like smash it with his hammer, and then Hymir basically cuts the line because he gets scared about what's going on. So he cuts the line, which then causes the serpent to go back into the water and kind of go back down to the depths where he lives. And then Thor gets really mad at Hymir and throws him overboard and essentially kills him in this story, in the Snorri's version of the story. Um, and of course, Thor would get angry about that because the Midgard serpent is what's going to kill Thor at Ragnarok. And so, Thor, I guess, thought maybe he had a chance at fighting fate at this point, but of course, that's not how fate works. So that's kind of an interesting factor, and that's something that um, I guess I appreciate about a lot of these Norse tales. This is especially true of Odin, that he's always going about trying to fight fate. He's trying to discover something about Ragnarok. We've seen that in several of the texts that we've been studying so far, where he wants some wisdom, some power in order to fight the fate that awaits him, his inevitable death at the twilight of the gods during Ragnarok. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I recently, in teaching Beowulf to my students on campus, when we got to the section with Beowulf and Unferth, who are fighting against each other with their little debate, I brought in Harbard's song, which is Loki and Odin, their debate. I brought that in as a parallel, and I got into it a little bit more, and Thor a couple times kind of chides Odin for always stirring up conflicts. And that's because Odin does that in order to get great warriors to fight each other. So that way they die. That way he can bolster his ranks, at Ragnarok. And so the gods, especially Odin, they're always trying to fight against this fate, this inevitable doom that's awaiting them. But of course, they can't do that because one thing that's unique about the Norse mythos is that even the gods are subject to fate, and they simply can't escape that. I don't know. I find that interesting. And also, there's this mention that the Midgard serpent is the brother of the wolf, which, according to the notes here, is Fenrir, who is the wolf that's going to kill Odin. And so Fenrir and the Midgard serpent are siblings, which I'm not quite sure how that works. Um,
Do you know
I
the
don't know.
history behind that?
Not entirely, especially since I know that Fenrir is actually Loki's child. Um,
They actually all are like so Jormungandr, Fenrir, and then Hel, like the goddess of the underworld. Like basically, I think this is in the Prose Edda as well. It's certainly in other sources, but there's a story where basically like Loki has an affair with the giantess Angrboda, and like these three children are kind of like these abominable, like accursed offspring from this sort of relationship with the giantess, and that like results in these three beings that are like technically his children, but then of course they all have like some sort of eschatological significance as well, as you had mentioned previously, especially with Jormungandr. So that's like the sourcing of all of these. It's certainly in like what I've read. I'm not sure if there's any like conflicting any like primary sources that have like conflicting narratives of that, but that's like the primary one I've seen.
it's interesting. Um,
Hmm.
I don't really have a much to work with this, but the first parallel that comes to my mind is in Paradise Lost. Milton has Satan basically um, relate himself to his own pride and that gives birth to this chaos monstrosity that is at the gates of hell. And I don't know, I think of some kind of parallelism here, of this chaos, this unnatural union. Even Loki, he's kind of amorphous sexually. Like sometimes he even takes the role of a female and actually gives birth to things himself. So this is all kinds of like chaos imagery wrapped up in the very person of Loki. Um, I really don't have any point to make with any of this, but it's just, but I guess that's the point of chaos. I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. I'd have to like think about that more before I'd comment on it. But I definitely it's an interesting parallel with like Paradise Lost there. So I'm gonna have to look into that one more.
Yeah, I definitely don't have
Yeah.
anything worked out on that.
It's just interesting that like through his affair, there's like two god-ending, basically monsters, Fenrir Wolf and the World Serpent, taking out Odin and Thor Ragnarok.
Right. I don't know what happens to Loki at Ragnarok. Does he die? Because I know not all the gods die.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember like if I, I believe yeah he like basically ends up in like hell or the underworld. But yeah, before I want to make that claim, I would definitely have to like go look
Mhm.
into that. But that's I read like a lot of like these like both with Greek like Greco-Roman and like Norse mythology. I read like the stories in like different like forms and like books as like a teenager, but even those you're never sure like how much some like modern fantasy authors is kind of like taking like creative freedom and just like riffing off of the
Right,
original
right.
sources. So yeah, I'm trying to remember like if that was like different in different versions and like but I'm not exactly sure which like what like the original or the really the canonical per se fate of like Loki would be in that. I know like obviously like Balder is like reborn and that's kind of like the big like almost like Christological symbol in a
Hmm.
sense with a lot of this, but yeah, I'm pretty sure like Loki does like kind of like end up in the underworld basically.
Yeah, I just did a quick Google search. It says Loki dies in battle with Heimdall in Ragnarok. And so yeah, so he dies in battle.
That's
Um,
it.
Although it is interesting, and this is referenced in one of the other texts that we look at, actually the next text, that Loki is the one who keeps Balder from coming back basically shortly after he dies. But I guess we can get back to that in a little bit. All right, and then yeah, and Chase mentioned that at the ending, it's a little bit haphazard because they do this swimming or this not swimming competition. That's Beowulf. They do this fishing competition, and then Thor is bragging about how great he is, and the giant says, "No, you're not. If you were that great and that strong, you could break this special goblet of mine, this chalice, which is like unbreakable." But then this giantess, for some reason, helps Thor out by telling him that he can break it if he breaks it on Hymir's head. So he breaks it on his head, and then he's allowed to take the cauldron. But then apparently he has to deal with giants nonetheless. Um, excuse me. And then his Thor's goat collapsed because of a curse from Loki, who is just now mentioned for the first time in this poem, which again kind of hints at there's some fragments of older versions of the story that are thrown in here. But it's interesting that so Odin, he has these goats that pull him around, which they show up very annoyingly that in the Marvel movie, the latest one of Thor, his goats. And these are special goats, and you can like kill them and even eat them, and then they resurrect the next day. But apparently, in another version of the story, Loki basically gets somebody to like break the bone and eat the marrow out, which then causes the goat to be lame when it resurrects, and so that's how we get to this cursed goat that collapses half dead all of a sudden. Um, I don't know. All right. Anything else to say about Hymir's poem?
So this is a super like random off the wall like thought that probably means absolutely nothing. But in the eighth stanza of the poem, it talks about the lad found his grandmother very ugly. She seemed to him 900 head. 900 heads she had. And so I'm almost like throwing out like just like a random number like 900 that is supposed to be like less literal and more like symbolic, or is it supposed to be more of like a historical report where it's like this is like about 900? Like because I think often it's like in the categories of like Jewish apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Enoch, or like obviously like Zechariah and like Revelation, where like that numbers a lot of times correlate to some other meaning other than some just mere historic narrative reporting. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts of that or if that's making any sense, but I was curious if you think there's actually any significance to like numbers like that being reported, or if there's any way of even telling that.
Yeah, I mean, given the genre of literature we're dealing with, I can only assume it's symbolic. I mean, I have no idea about Old Norse numerology, so I can't really comment on that specifically, but I can only assume that it's symbolic. And that's another reason why we have reason to think that Tyr was probably not the original companion, in that here it is said that his descendant, or that he comes from giants. Um, he's the one who said that, my father, this giant, has this great cauldron, which his father is not supposed to be a giant. And so there's definitely some mishmashing of stories going on here, um, with his ugly grandmother with 900 heads. Sounds pretty
Right.
ugly.
Yeah. Like I said, a super off the wall idea there. I'd be curious if there's any way to look into that. But yeah, I'd just be curious because I think of like almost like the number like 1,000 and like, a lot of like biblical categories and equating to like just many. I'm wondering if it's anything similar to that. But yeah, I have no idea either.
Yeah, no idea. No idea. All right. Well, I guess moving on to Loki's Quarrel, which is the next one, or Lokasena. Now, in this one, basically, the gods are having this great feast, drinking party, and Loki isn't invited. And so then he crashes the party and just goes one by one, calling them all cowards and perverts. So, what great insights do we have from Loki's Quarrel?
I think one thing I read that was interesting in I mean, like this edition of the text was that um, it says the poem may be early and thus the composition of a poet who believes in the divinities he burlesques. A little comedy cannot hurt the divinities whose cult is secure, or it may be late and the mockery be directed by a Christian poet at heathen divinities whose immortality contrasts with the stern morality of the new religion. So, obviously, without digging into the scholarship, it'd be hard to like form an opinion on whether this was earlier or later. But yeah, I always wonder like with these kind of stories, like how much like the Christian themes and even like kind of like the way Loki is treating the gods is more like anthropomorphic in a sense rather than being closer to something like transcendent or celestial. If that is like just kind of like poking at like them being like lesser beings than like the true like Christian God, or if it's really just Loki kind of being Loki and just being a cunning trickster and just poking fun at people in a sense. Yeah, I'm not sure on that one, but I'm curious if you guys have thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to think about. Um, I love this Loki. He just makes me think of Michael Scott saying "boom roasted" after every one of these because it just everyone is a response to somebody, and it's just uh, I could see if they did like the Marvel Loki, it would be coming from something like this, like this one where it's actually just kind of poking fun or um, cleverly going back against him.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, hard to say, especially since none of us are experts on the scholarship on this text. Um, that I mean, on one hand, assuming this was an older story, actually originally written by a pagan who believed in the gods, I mean, even still, like the pagan poets, um, don't usually believe that they're simply recording actual history. I mean, how would they know about the actual historical ongoings in Asgard? And so, they're still working within the realm of imagination. And so it would take, I think, quite a degree of, I don't know if it's confidence, courage, arrogance, whatever, to write, these attacks coming from the mouth of Loki against the gods. Because I mean, they do get right to it of you're a coward, or you're sleeping around with everyone and you're a pervert, or like they really go after the immorality of the gods. Now, likewise, we could also see this coming from maybe a Christian poet who's trying to demonstrate the fact that these are not gods worth serving. And so I mean, I could see it coming from either way. I think the introduction made sense on that. Um, Now, also, I do appreciate just kind of the rhythm that goes at this. As Chase was saying, the boom roasted thing that, he roasts somebody, and then like somebody else will speak up in their defense, and then he turns to them, and then someone else speaks up in their defense, and they basically just keeps going with this, with Loki acting as the dialogue partner to essentially everybody. He's going around in a sequential manner here. Um, Also, we get another Tolkien lift here with Mirkwood. So that's a good find.
I did see that. That was told my brother that right when I read it. It's cool.
Yeah. All right. Anything else from Loki's Quarrel?
I did have a thought on like the 11th stanza down there where it says hail to the Aesir, hail to the Asinior, and all the most sacred gods, except for that one god who sits further in, Bragi, on the benches. And I looked at the footnotes, and it kind of makes a claim that the one who sits further in is implying and or symbolic of like a place of higher honor in a sense. And so that made me think, is there any way in which this text could be implying that, Bragi, like the god of like this the god of like skaldic poetry per se, um, could that be making a claim potentially that like the art and like virtue of this form of poetry is like the highest of all values in that culture in some sense, or maybe the highest of values in this context? I'm not sure, like just like making like a distinction there of Bragi being in that specific place. I'm wondering if it has anything to do with that specifically.
Yeah, and so I mean, I can't really speak to why he would be in the seat of honor to begin with, but it does seem
Mm,
like Loki is elevating him for the purpose of knocking him down, right? That
yeah.
Loki is pointing to the fact that yes, you god of great honor, that basically you have so much honor that you don't actually do anything. He calls him a coward, that he's shyest of shooting, that he's the wariest of war, and so he calls him a coward. He just sits in honor but doesn't really do anything, and so it provides just a way for Loki to take kind of a pot shot at him. Um, Again, I just don't know enough about Norse mythology to really say much more about that, about the god in particular, but I can definitely see how Loki is making use of this perceived honor.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, like part of me like wants to believe there's some really cool like in-depth symbolism there, but yeah, it's probably just also just Loki being Loki. Is that's probably just like the default answer at the end of the day. I just have to
Yeah,
accept that.
like I do think that we can pull wisdom from a lot of these stories, but it's uh, the the so-called barbarian tales. Well, there's a reason why the Romans, call them barbarians. It's the very different kinds of stories at play here. It's a lot more just brutal and sort of guttural in the way that they treat each other.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I can kind of see where like a lot of like just like the stereotypes of like epic fantasy and such thing like today have like derived from this. You even mentioned like the swimming contest in Beowulf earlier, where he's kind of like, yeah, I know I did lose that swimming contest, but I was also like in a full plate of armor and like fighting sea monsters. So it's just like it always has to be like this is super manly justification for everything.
Right.
I love the insult. He's talking to Bela, um, and he ends with "You dung splattered dairymaid." And then Thor comes in and he's just like, "Be silent, perverse creature, my mighty hammer, Mjolnir, shall deprive you of speech. Your shoulder rock I shall strike off your neck, and then your life will be gone." It's like, okay, like Thor's coming in hot.
Yeah, and he's the only one who can really shut Loki up, because he just comes in full strength. And this is one point that is kind of interesting. When at that point, yeah, he says, "So be silent, perverse creature. My mighty hammer, Mjolnir, will deprive you of speech. I shall throw you up on the roads to the east. Afterwards, no one will ever see you." This seems to be a reference to another one of the stories of Thor, when Thor killed the giant Thjazi and took his eyes and threw them up into the sky, and they became stars. And and so basically he's threatening to kill Loki and to make him into stars, make his corpse into stars, just as he's done before. And there's another time when he kills Arvandil, Arvandil, and takes his toe and does the same thing. He throws it into the sky as a star. Now, what's interesting is, sorry, I'm butchering this name, I'm sure. Arvandil is also known in the wider Germanic tradition as Erendil. And so this is the Norse version of the Star of Erendil, which, of course, Tolkien is going to pick up as he picks up that tradition as it comes through the Anglo-Saxons and eventually makes its way to Tolkien. So I just find that interesting that the great mariner of Erendil in Tolkien's story that was the beginning of his mythology. I mean, finds his way back in Thor, throwing a giant's toe into the sky.
Yeah, I think even the start of that exchange too, when Thor comes in, like right before Bela was saying, like all the mountain range shakes. I think Thor must be on his way home. Like they know that he's the kind of guy to handle it, um, the doer. It seems like for a lot of the gods, uh, for the ones that kind of sit back. Or
Right. And you can only assume the reason why Thor wasn't there to begin with is because he was off killing giants or something.
I
Right.
wonder too, like how many of these like allegations like Loki are making. Like obviously like some of them can be like qualified or like corroborated in like other sources in a sense, but some of them I'm just like I wonder if there's any basis for some of the claims he's making, or if he's just kind of just throwing some of it out there, right? Like I'm not entirely sure, but he certainly got like an accusation for everybody, sometimes more than one.
Yeah, I imagine there's always at least some grain of truth in this, in that these are the kinds of things the gods did. Like, I mean, going back to that, Harbard song, like Odin is very clear about his various exploits with the women folk. And so this is probably the kinds of stuff they did. But at the same time, excuse me, still overcoming a cold here. Um, I think of in Beowulf, even when Beowulf calls Unferth a kinslayer, um, probably he was a kinslayer. Excuse me. But at the same time, the fact that he was in Hrothgar's court means that he probably had some legitimate reason for killing his kin, like to defend Hrothgar or something like that. And so a lot of times in these Germanic insult fights, there's some grain of truth that gets like twisted and like we just want to find some way to jab that knife into what's probably already a dicey subject. So there's probably some truth to a lot of this. All right. Anything else from Loki's Quarrel? Okay, then moving on to Thrym's poem, or Thrymsk Thrymskvida. So the comedy of Thrym's poem depends on the characterization of Freya and Thor, who are compelled to act against their reputations. Freya is indignant when Loki and Thor suggest that she might marry a giant, though her reputation for promiscuity is such that taking a giant as a sexual partner might not be regarded as out of the question. Thor is the most masculine of the gods, who, dressing up as a woman, causes him acute embarrassment. Thrym, who has stolen Thor's hammer, is a giant with considerable social pretensions. The simple structure and repetitiveness of the poem proved suitable for adaptation into the ballad form, and a number of versions of it are found among Danish and Swedish ballads. Okay, so any thoughts on this poem of Thor retrieving his hammer?
This is probably another really out there thing that I could read way too much into, but on the second stanza, like the last line, like it says like the god like with a capital G. I'm not sure if that's just like a translation slash like punctuation thing, or if there's some sort of like greater implication with that versus like the god like lowercase g. Um, Again, it could literally just be like because like with like the semicolon there, maybe it's like literally just like a grammatical thing. But I was curious if that was somehow like an elevation of Thor referring to the god, the one who has been robbed of his hammer.
Yeah, that stuck out to me as well, and that not really knowing. My assumption is that this is emphasizing the reality that of Thor, the fact that he's had his hammer stolen is such a big deal that in this context, he is the god who has been dishonored. Like it's a way of elevating him. That's my assumption. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting. He has to borrow Freya's feather shirt so that he can fly, is my understanding. So I guess that's not something he can do on his own. I'm gonna be honest, this is one that I actually just don't remember a lot of details on. I didn't take a lot of notes.
I kind of wonder because obviously it highlights the fact that like obviously Thor like dresses up has to like dress up as a woman and basically impersonate Freya, right? So
Mm.
the fact that he's kind of like, ashamed and uncomfortable with that. Like, do you think that's like a pride and humiliation thing, or do you think like there's like like he's pretty justified in feeling that way because he's in a sense like a symbol of this like kind of like classical or like medieval like Norse masculinity in a sense. Like it's like is it pretty justifiable that he's like uncomfortable with that? And like I would personally probably say yes because even as a 21st century man, I would be too, right? So I can't imagine how Thor would feel. But yeah, I was kind of thinking about that where I'm like I could see how somebody would almost like go the direction where it's like oh like he just needs to be comfortable with it, but I'm like no, like he probably shouldn't be comfortable with that at the same time.
Wait, you wouldn't be comfortable wearing a dress and pretending to marry a giant?
Ugh, I, I,
It's
I
not very
can't
progressive of
I
you.
can't say that I would.
Bigot.
Guilty as charged.
I think just coming from Loki's Quarrel, it's funny because Loki's flying off and it gets like the interaction with the giant, and then here's kind of like what has to be done. And he had just like accused Freya, I think, of being very promiscuous. And then, you know, the agreed upon fix is that Thor's going to dress up as in a dress to go be the bride. And I'm sure he found you know, some enjoyment in that.
Yeah, and I assume that, excuse me, sorry, so overcoming this cough here. I assume that he's that this is really meant to be a comedy, right? It's supposed to be funny. You've got this masculine, the most masculine of the gods, this great warrior who's always, killing giants, and he's always just bragging about what a great warrior he is. That now he has to submit himself to playing the part of a woman. And I guess it shows us also that the giants aren't all that cunning. I mean, he starts to get a little thrown off, saying like, "There's a fire in your eyes that I'm not used to here." So he's getting a little worried, but he still is pretty much okay with it and keeps moving forward. The fact that his bride to be is like consuming vast amounts of food, but I guess he just is so enamored with his bride or his idea of his bride that he's willing to buy all these ridiculous excuses till finally he presents the hammer of Thor, and then of course promptly dies.
It was cool seeing just kind of the notes. I mean, throughout all this stuff, but even where it says like "let keys jingle by his side," I guess like I had no idea what that was, but because like the bride or the wife would have like the keys to like the pantry and all the storage stuff, which is cool.
I like the prose conclusion here that after this whole story about how Thor, finally killed the giant with his hammer and got out of there, that it ends with, "So Odin's son got the hammer back." A good summary.
It seems almost like a little bit unnecessary. It's like, yeah, of course he got the hammer. You really think he didn't get it back? Like,
Right. Reminds me of a few times in the Bible where things like that happen, like when Jael, nails the pent tag through the guy's head, and it says, "And he died." Like, yep, that'll happen.
They battered all the race of giants. Yeah.
I do wonder what this giant, what Thrym, what exactly he was intending. It says, "Then Thrym, the Lord of Ogres, bring in the hammer to sanctify the bride. Lay Mjolnir on the girl's lap. Consecrate us together by the hand of Var." I wonder, like, uh, what significance the hammer had for him, the giant, and what way. I mean, I guess it's just that it's an artifact of the gods or something. But I don't know what sanctifying role this would have for her.
It's only the Marvel version that he can only lift the hammer, right? That's not like anything in
It seems
this.
to be the case.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the starting place that most of us are working with. But yeah, that does not seem to be the case here.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else from this poem? All right. Then moving on to Volund. All right. The poem of Volund, or Vo- appears to be a combination of two poems. The first, the tale of the Swan Maidens, and the second, the tale of Volund's imprisonment and his revenge. Volund is a strange character, neither human nor divine. At one point, he's referred to as Prince of Elves. Since we know so little about elves in the Norse mythic scheme, we cannot prove or disprove this attribution. And so Voland is some kind of elf, which, as it just said here, we don't really know what elves are based off the original Norse text here. They're these ambiguous kinds of creatures that, um, and maybe that's part of the nature of elves, or what we would, later refer to as fairies, that they live kind of on the, beyond firm categories, sort of on the barriers of knowledge. And this Voland gets kidnapped by this king, but then he manages to escape, and that's the big point of the story. And so, I don't know, what do we think of this story, or what are some thoughts you have?
It's interesting, like you had brought up earlier with Mirkwood scene here,
Hmm.
which has always seemed mysterious and kind of a lot of stuff happening, which kind of goes with the story, I feel like too.
Yeah, because some weird stuff happens. And so you've got these three brothers, and they fall for, or they embrace these three strange women. Think these swan women, swan herders or something. And then these, after, was it 9 years? Yeah, 9 years, the women just leave, and two of the brothers go off looking for them. Volan stays home to make rings for his lady, which is when he gets captured, when he's by himself by this local king. And so there's just kind of there's weird stuff going on in this forest, which again kind of gives us some of the Tolkien Mirkwood vibe as well.
It also brings up like the Lappish Kings in the prose at the beginning, which I know earlier they had kind of talked about. I think it was in Grimnir sayings with with the torture and everything kind of or was related to the ritualistic of the Lap
Hmm.
people. So I mean, they're coming from it seems like kind of a harsher, more mystical people. Um, Especially if it's the king, that's kind of how they talked about them. And then with the Swan Maidens being does say they were Valkyries, but it wasn't exactly sure kind of what that they could fly, I guess, because they had the swan feathers, but it's interesting.
Yeah, and later in the story, the way that he escapes is, I'm not jumping to the end here, but the way he escapes is he managed to get his ring back that the king had taken from him, and he seems to be able to turn into a swan or something like that, which he's able to fly around. Um, and so, so now we've got Mirkwood, and now we've got magic rings. And so I assume it's because he was forging this ring for the Swan Maiden, that there's some connection there with like being able to be like a swan. Don't know where to go from there, but
Like how he just skis and then goes and kills a she bear, brings it back.
right,
Pretty metal.
right. And one thing that I think is worth noticing is that, even, I mean, I don't even know if Volan can be called a hero. I mean, he's as much a trickster as anybody else. In that, I mean, yeah, he's a victim when he gets captured by the king, and he's made to basically be the king's slave smithy, making stuff for him. And because the king's wife, the queen, advises that Volan be hamstrung so that way he can't run away. And so he's forced to be on this island and to just make things for the king. But he ends up tricking the king's sons into coming to him by promising him great treasure. And he just kills them and buries them. And then he gets the king's daughter to come to him and he seduces her and, impregnates her. And that's in part how he gets his ring back, which then he's able to use to fly away. And then, that's kind of his parting insult to the king is that, now my offspring is in your court. See you later. He flies away. So he's very much a trickster, which I guess connects with the idea of being an elf in that, he's again kind of beyond the categories of order. He's not somebody that you can beat, that you can tame. He's not something you can domesticate. That the king was operating with a force that was outside of what he could possibly control. And so maybe there's some kind of message here regarding domination, which again could be very Tolkienian in that the more that you try to dominate, well, the more that you are going to find yourself dominated by the very power that you're trying to seize for yourself. So there may be some kind of power lesson to be understood here.
Yeah, I think of him being like a stronger guy too, because like having to cut his, hamstring him so that he doesn't, and he actually doesn't like. It's not like they bound him face to face, like they took him down, but he had just like fallen asleep because he was just waiting on his bride that he thought was there. Um, I did see they talked about how the later prose account in Thédric's saga, um, one of his brothers comes back to save him, and then later on, Volund returns with an army and then kills the king and marries Bodvild, and then their son becomes like a great Germanic hero. So interesting how it changes throughout.
Yeah, I guess that he's like a trickster. And there's some certainly bizarre aspects to the poem itself. I think there almost is like a level of admirability I have for like the character of Voland himself, just like merely speaking in terms of just kind of like the resilience in the face of adversity. Like he's trapped in this situation. Like it seems like he's just fated to be there forever. But however that ultimately works out, like he does find a way to kind of like escape this servile life and actually like become liberated. In a way, it's almost like in like a weird way, it's almost kind of like the Shawshank Redemption in a sense, where like this guy like in like the most impossible way like finds a way out when it seems like impossible. Yeah, that's something I kind of saw through that. There is like a level of admirability like for the character himself, I think.
Yeah, there's a kind of pagan virtue here. And obviously, we're not going
Mhm.
to look at Volan and say he's anything like Christian virtue. And I know that's not the point you're making, but there is something here. Excuse me. And we see that, even Odin has a trickster element to him, and that he's always kind of manipulating people in order to achieve his ends. And that's part of, I think, what Norse wisdom was, right? It was about power. I'm able to assert myself. I'm able to make things better for me and for my kin. Um, we see this if you read the Volsung saga, that, I think Zygmunt mix him up with Sigurd sometimes because Beowulf kind of changes some of that. But when he's going off and he's just like raiding people, that's not seen as a bad thing. It's just something that you do to advance your station and that of your kin. Read the Havamal, the Proverbs in the Edda, and there's a lot of that mentality there, where virtue is just kind of what it takes to get ahead. The best way to understand that, or at least wisdom. It's about more cunning than anything else. Um, and I think that we do see that. And with that kind of framing, maybe Voland is a kind of hero, a kind of a person to admire.
Yeah, I mean, with the is it sayings of the High One where he talks about like it's said multiple times, like whenever you receive a lie, like return it with deception. So it's not like even, you're like stupid, don't take the high road, go down and you're gonna win against this lie that's been brought up against you.
Yeah, I mean these Norse heroes, they're street fighters, right? It's just you get in there and you do what it takes to win, and that's really what it comes down to. And so um, the idea of honor and virtue. These things just mean something very different than how we're used to talking about them. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. I think that it's useful to um, kind of look with these different eyes and just see, what did these people honor, and why did this translate into tales that are still around and that are still discussed today and play such an important role in the cultural world in which we live. I'm not going to say that we need to go back to this kind of virtue because there's a lot very wrong with this. But at the same time, we need to, even Tolkien says this, that in order to really know what's wrong with something, you have to see what's good within that thing first. And that's going to help you to better understand what is wrong with it. And it's going to give you the opportunity to recognize the light where it is and then bring it back into proper focus. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at some of these, what we would see as very flawed heroes, and seeing that there's something admirable about that and recognizing that. Any other
Yeah,
thoughts? Yeah.
I disagree. I don't have any other thoughts right now.
Well, see, was that the last one from the section? All right. Well, this was definitely not an easy run, but I feel like we've pulled something out of this. Um, I had mentioned going in just a little while ago that maybe we could provide some recommendations. Do you guys have anything offhand that you'd like to kind of endorse to anybody's listening? Anything you've been listening to, reading, kind of wherever you want to go with that? Josh, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I actually had an idea for that when I saw that earlier. So, I think one thing I recommend just for like a good, just kind of like robust perspective on more of like a traditional reading of a lot of different literature is actually the Ignatius critical editions of different books. So you kind of see an example here of like Gulliver's Travels, Hamlet, like Pride and Prejudice. Like then they do a bunch of other stuff as well. But Joseph Pierce, I don't know if anybody's familiar with him, but he's like the main editor for a lot of those. Very solid, like just traditional understandings and interpretations of a lot of these works, and it provides a lot of really like top notch like scholarly essays like within the actual volumes themselves, like along with the primary text itself. So I found those very helpful personally, just for understanding these works and helping me to kind of grow out of reading them through like a very just like modernist, like late 20th, early 21st century lens, like as I was certainly taught through going through like the public education system as a kid and as a teenager. So I definitely like recommend those pretty highly, I would say. I think they're good additions. And they're
Yeah,
also
good.
pretty
Fantastic. Yeah.
affordable.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I've got a few of those, and so I definitely second that. Cool. Chase, do you have anything for us?
I mean, just some books I've read over the last year. Recommended even this weekend. I met a guy that was into philosophy, and I had brought up Boethius. He had never heard of it, so he wrote down the Constellation of Philosophy to read that. Um, Another book from the last year that I've read was Defenders of the West. That was a really good read on just uh, Christian heroes of old and kind of a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily a different perspective from what you get in typical public school. So
Wait, you mean Christians haven't always been the bad guys? Interesting.
they were
Um,
just doing it for gold.
that's right. Those greedy Christians. Um, so I've got a couple books. I think I might have recommended this on a recent podcast. I'm not sure. But I've been reading a lot for the upcoming Tolkien study. I know that I still need to get out my supplemental reading list, and so I'll get that done probably tomorrow. But a couple books that I've read recently is The Philosophy of Tolkien by Peter Kraft, which if anyone, I mean, probably most of the people listening to this probably do already follow me on Twitter. I tweeted out a lot of this when I went through it recently. It's really good. If you want an introduction to philosophy, it's actually a pretty good text if you're already kind of familiar with Tolkien and you've never studied philosophy before. He even says in his intro that it can serve that kind of purpose. But even if you do already have some philosophical background, it's just a great book to get you excited about how good Tolkien is. And so definitely recommend that. And then for a deeper dive into Tolkien and philosophy, I really enjoyed my background's messing this up. The Flame Imperishable by Jonathan McIntosh, subtitled Tolkien, St. Thomas, and the Metaphysics of Fairy. And so in this text, he's mostly focusing on the Ainulindale, Tolkien's opening creation story in the Silmarillion, and relating that to the theology of Thomas Aquinas, and just a great philosophical dive into the underworkings of Tolkien's world. And you cannot read this text and then come out with the preposterous belief that Tolkien was not giving us a Christian story. He most certainly was, as Tolkien himself said, but unfortunately, that's still an argument that has to be had on a regular basis, usually with those Tolkien Society folks. But one day, I want to start a Tolkien Society for people who actually like Tolkien. That's my goal in life. Um, but that's where I guess we'll leave it from here. Do either of you have anything else that you wanted to say?
I mean, I'll second your Peter Kreeft recommendation, and I'll also can you please clarify a little bit more that you don't agree with Michael Moorcock's epic poo essay? Have you ever read that?
Wait, was that the
Oh
one
my
where?
God.
Wait, what? I might have. What was that one?
It's like I think he like wrote it in like the 70s or something, but he's basically just like almost like imposing just these more like modernist, like Marxist claims like on Tolkien in a sense. And then if anybody's familiar with the sci-fi author Gene Wolfe, like he writes an essay in response to it, and it's incredible. I'll send this to you guys in the chat for sure. But both of them, Epic Pooh sucks. It's terrible, but Gene Wolfe's essay is really great.
I was at a bachelor party with some guys this weekend and was talking about Lord of the Rings. And one of the guys, I had never met him before, and he was like, "Yeah, Lord of the Rings is great." He's like, "It other than like how Tolkien treats the goblins and the orcs."
There we go.
I was just like, the face dropped.
Yeah, I mean, there's that article that makes its rounds every once in a while from the UK saying that Lord of the Rings in 1984 are right-wing propaganda texts or something. It's just absurd.
Pretty sure like an Epic Pooh like Moorcock like makes the claim that basically like there's like some sort of like just like slave morality ethic and the way like Frodo teaches like treats Sam, like it's just it's so terrible. I have to find this and send it to you guys so you can read it for yourself.
I feel like we need to have some standalone patron chat just about Tolkien and his legacy and all this stuff. That might be something worth doing. Um,
I'm down.
cool. So maybe we'll work on that. Maybe once the semester's over here, we can have a bonus episode at some point. But that's for another time. For now, good talk on the Edda, and next time we'll cover some more stuff. So until then, Godspeed. Thanks again for joining us, and if you'd like to support the show and have the opportunity to join these chats, as well as to access some exclusive content, including the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course, then you can become a patron over at patreon.com/mythicmind, and you can find that link in the show notes. But that's it for now, and until next time, Godspeed. The Mythic Mind Fellowship presents a new study led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, The Wisdom of Middle-earth, The Lord of the Rings. This will be the first study in the Wisdom of Middle-earth series, which seeks to bring an array of companions together with the common desire of growing in wisdom while enjoying the heartening tales of the great tale weaver, J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a profound tale that has literally changed lives, as it has for mine. And what is it that makes this story so powerful and so compelling? It is because Tolkien's stories are fundamentally true, and those who engage with it know exactly what I mean. They speak to the way that things are. As Peter Kreeft said in The Philosophy of Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings is infused with the same light that illumined the man who wrote it, and that light is true, for it reveals the reality of the world and life. So join us on this adventure. Let us grow in wisdom together through immersion in this tale, not through cheap allegorizing, but by getting a better understanding of the ideas and the movements of the heart that bring a tale such as this to life. This 12-week study will begin with Tolkien's creation account, the Ainulindale, and then move to the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Each week will include a signed reading from The Lord of the Rings, a short side lesson at the beginning of the week that addresses a relevant theme, background story, or secondary text. And then, once you've had some time to do the reading, there will be a longer video that serves as a guide in these forests of wisdom. Also, we will have additional recommended readings, an active Discord channel, and weekly live meetings, which will be recorded in case you cannot attend. Whether you are reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time or the 11th time, I invite you to join our company. Prices are currently as low as they ever have been, and they are as low as they ever will be, so go ahead and join today at andrewsnyder.podia.com. And I hope to see you on this road that goes ever on.